Baby found German Shepherd carrying groceries. What she did next left everyone in tears. The sound was barely there, a soft cry, hidden beneath concrete and chaos. What followed was a journey so unbelievable, even those who witnessed it struggled to explain it. This is the kind of story that hurts your heart and then heals it. If you've ever doubted kindness, stay with us. This one's for you. The street was sinking into that golden kind of evening where everything felt softer, slower. The sun spilled across the cracked sidewalks, catching in the weeds that had pushed their way up between the stones. Porch lights hadn't yet flickered on, but the air already carried that faint, cooling edge that meant the day was ready to let go. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower hummed lazily, its sound drifting in and out with the breeze. From the far corner, a shape appeared, moving with a determined, uneven rhythm. At first, it was just a shadow against the fading light, but as it drew closer, the figure resolved into an old German shepherd. Her fur was sun-bleached at the tips, darkened at the joints, and dust clung to the feathering around her legs. Between her jaws hung a cloth grocery bag, the kind you'd see tucked under someone's arm on a Saturday morning trip to the market. It swayed gently with each step she took, the fabric stretching just enough to reveal its contents. A loaf of bread still warm enough to fog the paper sleeve, a carton of milk leaning on its side, and most curious of all, 2 small jars of baby food that clinked together softly with each movement. The sight was strange enough to make you blink twice. Dogs didn't carry groceries, at least not like this. And yet, here she was, steady and careful, adjusting her grip now and then as though she'd been doing this for years. She reached the low picket fence in front of one small, weather-worn house and stopped. Inside the yard, a little girl, no more than 2, sat on the patchy grass, legs splayed in front of her as she tapped a plastic cup against the ground. The game stopped the moment her wide eyes found the shepherd. For a second, they simply stared at each other, child and dog, bathed in the last burnished light of the day. The baby's cup slipped from her fingers, landing with a dull thud on the dirt. The dog didn't move away. She shifted her weight, the bag swaying gently between her teeth, and took a single step closer to the gate. The rusted hinge gave a slow, drawn-out squeak in the evening stillness. The girl tilted her head, the way only toddlers do, curiosity winning over caution. A light gust caught the grocery bag just enough to carry the smell of warm bread toward the porch, mingling with the faint scent of milk and the sharper tang of something green, celery, maybe. It wasn't just groceries, it was a small delivery of care. From the porch, somewhere just out of sight, a shadow moved. Someone watching, caught between stepping forward and holding back, unsure what exactly was happening. The shepherd's eyes flicked once toward that shape, then back to the baby. The jars of baby food knocked softly against each other, a gentle chime that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. If you'd been standing there watching the scene unfold, you might have felt it too, that tug in your chest, the pull between stepping in to help or simply following to see where this strange mission led. Because whatever this old dog was doing, it was no accident. And what she was about to reveal wasn't just unusual, it was the beginning of a story no one on this street, or in this neighborhood, had ever truly known. A story of loyalty, quiet heroism, and a love so persistent, it carried the weight of groceries one step at a time. Emily had been leaning against the porch rail, a chipped mug of coffee cooling between her hands, watching her daughter explore the yard with the kind of single-minded focus only a toddler could manage. Sophie was fascinated with a ladybug inching its way across the rim of her overturned bucket, murmuring her own private commentary in sounds more like music than words. The late sunlight draped itself over the lawn, turning every blade of grass gold and making the peeling paint on the fence look almost deliberate, like some rustic touch you might see in a magazine. It was Sophie who noticed her first, the sudden pause, the small intake of breath, the way her head swiveled toward the gate. Emily followed her gaze, expecting a neighbor or maybe a stray cat. Instead, she saw the same weathered German Shepherd from earlier, standing perfectly still at the edge of the fence, the cloth grocery bag hanging from her mouth. The weight of it pulled the fabric into soft folds, the bread peeking out, the milk carton balanced carefully, and the baby food jars catching the light in small glints. Sophie let out a delighted little squeal, stumbling forward in that unsteady half-walk, half-bounce toddlers have when they're determined to reach something. Emily set her mug down and straightened, ready to scoop her daughter up if the dog reacted badly. But the shepherd didn't move, didn't step forward or back. She just watched, her eyes locked on Sophie with an expression Emily couldn't quite read. Alert, yes, but calm, and somehow expectant. By the time Sophie reached the gate, pressing her small hands against the slats, Emily had moved down the porch steps, her bare feet silent on the warm boards. Up close, the dog looked older than she'd seemed at a distance. Dust clung to the edges of her fur, and her paw pads were darkened and worn, as if she'd walked many miles over rough ground. But her posture was steady, the bag held in a firm grip that spoke of practice. It was then that Emily noticed a small scrap of paper tied to the handle of the grocery bag with a piece of twine. She crouched slowly, extending a hand toward it, careful not to spook the dog. The handwriting was shaky but legible: milk, bread, baby food. Nothing else. No name, no address. Just the list, as if it were all that mattered. Emily glanced at the shepherd's neck. There was no collar, no tag jingling in the quiet. But nothing about her felt like a stray. Her coat, though dusty, was free of mats. Her eyes were bright, scanning the space like a soldier taking in a new terrain. There was purpose in the way she stood, in the measured breaths she took. Sophie reached one tiny hand through the gap in the slats, and Emily's breath caught. But the dog simply lowered her head a fraction, enough for Sophie's fingers to brush the fabric of the bag. The jars inside clinked softly, and the shepherd's ears twitched. Emily waited for her to leave, to turn and carry on with whatever errand she was on. But the dog didn't move. She stood there, steady and patient, as if this moment, this meeting, was the thing she had come for. The air between them seemed to thicken, carrying something unspoken, the way certain encounters feel like the middle of a story instead of the beginning. Emily stepped closer, one hand on Sophie's shoulder, eyes meeting the shepherd's. "Who are you?" she asked quietly, not really expecting an answer but feeling the question needed to be said aloud. The shepherd blinked slowly, the grocery bag swaying gently with the movement. And then she simply waited, her gaze steady, as though she knew the baby had noticed her, and that was, somehow, the point. Sophie, with the stubborn determination only a 2-year-old could muster, toddled off toward the porch without a word. Emily thought for a moment that her daughter had lost interest in the shepherd, but then she saw the little girl digging through her scattered toys by the step. Sophie's small hand emerged clutching a bright red plastic apple, the kind that came from her pretend kitchen set. She marched back to the gate, her brow furrowed in concentration, and thrust the toy forward between the slats. The shepherd's ears flicked toward the offering, and for the first time, she moved with real intention. She lowered the grocery bag onto the patch of dirt beside her paws, careful as if setting down something fragile, then stepped closer to the gate. Her nose touched the toy apple, inhaling in slow, deliberate sniffs. Sophie giggled, wiggling the apple for emphasis, and the dog let out a low, almost satisfied huff before retreating a step and reclaiming her bag. Emily took the chance to crouch down again, her fingers finding the little scrap of paper tied to the handle. She untwisted the twine enough to see it properly. The handwriting was the kind that came from someone and used to writing often. Shaky, uneven letters pressed hard into the paper. Milk, bread, baby food. The simplicity of it was almost unsettling. No store name. No instructions. Just those three things, as if they summed up the whole of someone's world. She looked at the shepherd again, really looked this time. There was no collar, no tag, but also no wildness about her. Her eyes were bright, focused, their gaze darting from Sophie to the bag to the street beyond. This wasn't an animal wandering for scraps. This was something else. "Want some water, girl?" Emily asked softly, rising to fetch the metal bowl from beside the porch. She filled it halfway from the kitchen tap and set it just inside the gate, nudging it forward with her foot. The dog glanced at it once but didn't move. Instead, she shifted the bag's handle higher in her mouth and stepped sideways, nudging it toward the street with a small, deliberate push of her muzzle. From across the road, a screen door creaked, and Mr. Dawson from number 12 stepped out onto his porch. He shaded his eyes with one hand. "That the old shepherd again?" he called, his voice carrying easily in the quiet. Emily straightened, surprised. "You've seen her before?" He nodded, leaning on the railing. "Couple times. Always with a bag in her mouth. Comes from the West End, far as I can tell. Never stuck around long enough for me to get close." Another voice joined in, Mrs. Thompson, watering her geraniums 2 doors down. "She's been doing that for months," she said. "I thought someone was training her for fun. Guess I never really thought about it." Emily looked back at the shepherd, who was standing poised at the open gap in the fence line, glancing toward the street like she was aware the conversation was about her and couldn't be bothered to stop for it. The air had shifted, carrying the faint smell of fresh bread from the bag, mixed with the dust rising from the road as a car passed at the far end of the block. Sophie, oblivious to the tension, tapped her apple against the slats again, murmuring something only she and the dog could understand. The shepherd flicked her tail once in response but made no move to approach again. Instead, she adjusted her stance, the bag swaying as though reminding Emily of its importance. It struck Emily suddenly, this wasn't random. This wasn't a novelty trick or a coincidence. Whatever this dog was doing, she'd done it before. And if the looks on her neighbors' faces were anything to go by, she'd been doing it for a long time. Emily tightened her grip on the fence, a flicker of unease mixing with curiosity. She didn't know where the shepherd was going or who had written that list, but something told her that if she let the dog leave without finding out, she'd regret it. Because there was a story here, she could feel it, and it had been walking quietly through this neighborhood for months, maybe longer, carrying its groceries like a secret no one had thought to follow. Emily didn't plan it so much as feel herself swept into it, the way a quiet stream will suddenly hurry you along when the riverbed narrows. She buckled Sophie into the stroller with practiced, one-handed clicks, sippy cup wedged in the side pocket, sun hat crooked over soft curls, and lifted the latch on the front gate. The shepherd glanced back at the sound, head tilting as if taking attendance, then turned toward the street with the calm assurance of someone who knew the route better than her own paw prints. "We're coming," Emily murmured, and the words surprised her with how natural they felt. Following a stranger's dog down the block felt less like danger than like joining a story already half told. The evening had melted into that syrupy, golden hour glow, the light pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk and gilding the dandelions along the curb. The stroller's wheels rattled over uneven concrete, each seemed ticking underfoot like a metronome. A lawnmower droned somewhere far off, its rhythm broken by a boy's whoop when the catcher bag filled and needed emptying. The shepherd moved ahead in an unhurried trot, grocery bag balanced carefully from her jaws. Twice in the first block, she paused and set the bag down, not with a careless drop but a deliberate lowering, the handle still hooked on a canine tooth so it never kissed the ground. She shifted her bite a notch to the side, tested the weight with a flex of her jaw, and continued. "Bread, milk, baby food," the note had said. The bag gave off a warm, yeasty whiff each time it swung, and every so often the bottles inside clinked as they tapped one another, a fragile heartbeat inside cloth. They turned off Maple onto Clover and left the wholesome rows of freshly painted porches for the tired, shaded lane that ran along the back of the shops. Here the air cooled even with the sun still up, the alley cramped and hemmed by old brick, the smell of cut grass traded for damp cardboard, espresso grounds, and the metallic tang of dumpsters. A cat watched from atop a cinder-block wall, tail flicking disdainfully at their procession. Sophie craned in her seat to follow it, pointing with a sticky finger. "Kitty," she announced with reverence. The shepherd flicked an ear but never broke stride. She threaded between a pair of recycling bins and a stack of flattened boxes, choosing the narrowest line in a way that spared the bag's contents any bump. At the far end of the alley she paused, looking right, then left, the way a person might at a crosswalk. She seemed to count the cars by sound more than sight, patient, unmoved by the impatience of the sparrows fussing in the gutter. Across Pine, the neighborhood changed. Lawns gave way to fenceless lots with dirt worn into paths by footsteps that never bothered with sidewalks. An old man sat on a stoop with a radio, the game's play-by-play curling out between static like smoke. He lifted two fingers in a salute as the strange caravan passed, and Emily wondered if he knew their guide's name. They reached the creek, where the old footbridge slouched under a patchwork of city repairs, planks replaced in brighter wood among the gray bolts that glittered new against rust. The water ran low and brown beneath them, catchlights flashing on beer cans snagged against reeds. As they crossed, the shepherd slowed, the bag brushing her chest. A wind rose from the water and flapped the stroller's sunshade, setting the cloth to rattling. Sophie squealed at the sound and then fell quiet, watching, as if even at 2 she could sense the world tucking in closer, the way it does when you are about to learn a secret. On the far bank the sidewalk gave up entirely. The shepherd chose a dirt path that curled behind a shuttered garden center where vine tendrils had braided themselves through the slats of an old pallet. The scent of damp earth pressed up from the ground, rich and loamy, threaded with something else. Old wood warmed all day and now releasing its sap-sweet breath. A cicada started up in the sycamore and then stopped again as if remembering it was too early in the season. Somewhere a wind chime bickered against itself, a mild complaint in the breeze. They came to a four-way without signage, just the memory of paint on the asphalt. The shepherd set the bag down again, performing her careful, fussy adjustment ritual. She nosed the knot at the handle, tested the length of it the way a seamstress might eye a hem, then picked it up from a fresh angle and seemed satisfied. Emily found herself slowing her own steps to mirror the dog's patience, matching breath with movement, ridiculous and yet grounding. She glanced behind them. No one followed. Mr. Dawson's porch was out of sight, Clover Street's tidy certainty lost beyond the bend. The quiet here was of a different species, not suburban silence but the hush of a place that had been forgotten by the polite version of the town. The houses beyond the bridge sagged into themselves, siding gone chalky, porch steps slanted. Yards grew more weeds than grass. A grocery cart rested on its side at the edge of a yard where someone had tried to start a garden and given up at rows of hopeful mounds. And yet, there were signs of life. Chalk hopscotch squares ghosted in pastel, a bicycle tire without its bike leaning against a chain-link fence, a window with a lace curtain that had been washed and rehung with care. The shepherd turned onto Willow Court, which wasn't a court so much as a stub of road that dead-ended into a tangle of privet and honeysuckle. She slowed for the first time as if measuring distance. Ahead, a leaning fence stitched itself along the lot line, each board a different height, a different shade of weathered gray, the top run sagging like a tired spine. The dog stopped before a gap where two slats had given up their duty and disappeared in sideways, the bag tilting as she made herself slender to slip through. Emily brought the stroller to a halt. The fence hid more than it revealed. Past those boards the yard turned to shadow, the late sun blocked by a house huddled close to its own bones. She could hear the hum of a refrigerator, or imagine she could, a faint electrical thrum hiding beneath the jug of mourning doves and the faraway rush of a highway that never fully slept. She reached for the fence and found the wood soft at the edges, splinters raised like hackles, warm where the sun had struck it all day. Sophie made a questioning sound, a hummed syllable with no word attached to it yet, and Emily smiled without looking down. "It's okay," she said, not sure which of them she was addressing. The gate, if it could be called that, was a panel held shut by a rope looped over a nail. Emily worked it loose, and the rope left a black smudge along her palm. The panel squealed as it swung inward, hinges rusted, a voice too long and used. The yard beyond was a patchwork of bare dirt and tough grass, jars turned upside down over tomato starts as makeshift cloches. A plastic kiddie pool collapsed into a pale blue pancake under a drift of leaves. On the back step, a laundry basket sat full of folded towels that had gone dusty waiting to be carried inside. The shepherd had set the grocery bag beside it. She was standing with her head cocked toward the back door, which was shut but not fully latched, the frame swollen by years of seasons. Her ears were turned forward, her attention fixed on a sound Emily couldn't catch at first. And then she did. Faint, as if it had been muffled in a pocket of the house, a thin cry rose and fell. It wasn't a cat. It wasn't a hinge or a screen door remembering a storm. It was higher than that, tremulous and insistent, a sound Emily knew in her bones before her brain named it, a baby's cry. Not a howling, furious wail, but the worn-down sobbing of need repeated until it frayed at the edges. The shepherd's body changed in the way a river changes at the bend. Same water, new urgency. She glanced back at Emily and the stroller, a brief, searching look that felt like a question. "You hear it too?" Her tail lifted a degree, not wagging so much as signaling alertness. She nosed the bag against the step so the handle faced upward, a neat arrangement for human hands. Emily swallowed, the swallow sticking halfway. The sound came again, through the crooked seam where the door didn't quite meet the frame. It skittered across her skin, pulled every mothering nerve tight, even the ones she hadn't known existed. "Hello," she called, voice low, feeling immediately foolish for speaking quietly as if quiet could keep the world from tipping. There was no answer. Not from inside and not from any neighbor, no rustle of curtain, no helpful head popping out from a porch. The yard had the feeling of a place between breaths. Sophie made another small noise and reached for Emily's wrist, fingers warm and damp. Emily squeezed back. "Sure," she murmured, though she wasn't sure to whom the shushing belonged, the baby, her daughter, herself, or the clockwork of the moment that seemed to be winding tighter by the second. The shepherd moved to the door and, with a gentleness that belonged to an old dog accustomed to doing careful things, pressed her nose to the peeling paint just beneath the latch. The door gave an inch. She pressed again and it swung wider, emitting a low moan from its hinges. Cool, still air breathed out, carrying the scent of closed-up rooms. Dust, old laundry, the ghost of last week's bacon. The cry sharpened, closer now, just beyond the dim threshold. Emily pushed the stroller forward until its front wheels bumped the step. She flipped the brake with her toe, bent to unbuckle, and lifted Sophie to her hip. The little girl burrowed into her shoulder, warm weight anchoring her like a purpose she didn't have to invent. "Stay with me," Emily whispered, and Sophie's arms tightened in answer. She stepped inside. The kitchen she entered had been tidy once. A checkered cloth lay over the table, salt and pepper shakers in the center sitting like sentries. A calendar on the wall had a month circled in blue and squares filled with pen, doctor appointment, 2 p.m., refill meds, groceries, milk, bread, baby food. The handwriting was the same shaky hand as the list tied to the bag. A plastic bottle sterilizer sat on the counter, unplugged. The shepherd's claws clicked once on linoleum as she led the way down the narrow hall. past a living room whose blinds had been drawn and then forgotten, light slicing the dark into bars. The cry came from the back room. The door there was ajar, a gap just wide enough for the shepherd to slip through and then back, as if she'd practiced. Emily followed that sound, that thin tugging string, and as she reached the doorway, the shepherd turned, pressed her side lightly against Emily's leg, a steadying weight, an old soul's reassurance, and then looked up into her face. In those brown eyes there was no fear, only urgency and a plea so plain it needed no grammar. Please. The room was small, painted a soft color that looked gray in the dim. A bassinet sat near the window, a crocheted blanket askew over its edge. The cry rose from within, raw, tired, but strong. And sitting beside it, on an old chair patched with duct tape, lay the shape of this house's other silence. A person slumped, breathing shallow, face turned toward the wall. Emily's breath caught. The shepherd took 3 quiet steps forward and placed the grocery bag at the chair's leg like a delivery completed. Then she touched her nose to the bassinet and let out a sound Emily had never heard from a dog, a whisper of a whine that sounded like a prayer. The rope slipped from the nail with a scratchy sigh, and the warped gate gave way under Emily's palm, swinging inward on complaining hinges. The shepherd didn't wait for invitation. She slipped through the gap like a shadow choosing its shape, tail held low but steady, the cloth grocery bag still hanging from her jaws. The yard was a hush of bare earth and stubborn weeds. The back step held a laundry basket of folded towels filled with dust, as if someone had lifted them from a dryer and then forgot the rest of the errand. The dog crossed to the door and nosed it in, patient and practiced, and cool, stale air spilled out carrying the faint smells of old coffee and baby lotion left uncapped. Inside, the living room had the careful order of a place that had tried to be tidy until life pulled it out of line. The blinds were half-tilted, slats slicing the wan afternoon light into quiet stripes across a sagging couch. A threadbare throw lay folded over one arm like a memory of neatness. In the middle of the room, against the wall where a television should have stood, there was a crib. Not the glossy white kind from catalogs, but a collapsible playpen with fabric mesh whose corners sagged a little from use. A soft, uncertain sound tugged the air, and Emily looked. A thin, pale baby, maybe a year old, maybe smaller from being underfed, lay on his back inside the crib, tiny hands batting at nothing. His hair sprang up in downy wisps, his mouth worked between a whimper and a breath. His eyes, when they found the shepherd, brightened with a relief so pure it was like sunlight breaking through a storm. "Oh," Emily breathed, the word barely sounded at all. No adult's voice answered. There were no footsteps from the hall, no rustle from the kitchen, only the metronome tick of a wall clock, a faraway car passing, the baby's whine, and the dog's nails clicking once as she crossed the worn rug. She set the grocery bag beside the crib with the reverence of an offering at an altar, then sat, haunches tight against the mesh, and lifted her chin to peer in. "Hey there, little man," Emily said softly, moving forward without quite deciding to. Sophie, perched on her hip, twisted to see, her cheek still warm against Emily's collarbone. The baby in the crib reached with fragile urgency toward the shepherd, fingers splayed, and the dog edged closer until her nose pressed the mesh. She breathed him in, then let out a low sound that wasn't a bark or a whine so much as a relieved exhale, the weight of a mission completed. Emily scanned the room even as her heart hammered, trying to assemble a story from its pieces. A folded quilt on the armchair. A bottle sterilizer unplugged on the side table. A flannel burp cloth draped over the back of a dining chair. On the coffee table, a framed photo face down. She picked it up without thinking and saw a young woman laughing into the camera, her hair pulled into a messy knot, a smear of sweet potato across her cheek. The same baby, cheeks rounder than, perched on her hip. The shepherd's head hovered just in frame at their knees. Emily set the photo carefully back and fumbled in her pocket for her phone. Her fingers were clumsy. She dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, practiced. Emily gave the address from the envelope stuck in a pile of mail on the sideboard, explained what she'd found and what she hadn't: the baby, the dog, the empty house. And the operator promised to send police and an ambulance. "Stay on the line if you can," the voice said. Emily tucked the phone between shoulder and ear and whispered, "I'm not leaving." She set Sophie down gently on the couch cushions, where the toddler immediately knelt to watch, hands clutching the seam of the upholstery, eyes big and serious. Emily crouched beside the grocery bag and opened it. The warm dust smell of cloth slipped away to reveal the soft reality of food: a loaf of bakery bread elastic under its paper, a half-gallon of milk sweating through its plastic, 3 small jars of baby food with their labels fraying at the edges. Carrots. Chicken with rice. The list tied to the handle had been written in the same shaky hand as the calendar she'd glimpsed in the kitchen. Milk, bread, baby food. She hesitated, the trespass of it, the care that belonged to someone else, and then the baby let out a thinner wail and that settled it. "Okay," she murmured, more to the room than to anyone. "We're going to get you something in that little belly." The shepherd's ear flicked toward her voice and then back to the baby. Emily washed her hands at the kitchen sink, the water smudging brown as dust lifted off the handle. There was formula tucked into the far corner of the counter, a scoop laid across the top as if it had been put down mid-motion and never picked up again. There were bottles, clean and dry on a towel. She reached for one, faltered, then put it back. "Baby food first," she said, trying to remember the rules learned and half forgotten in those foggy months when Sophie was tiny. "Something gentle." Back in the living room, she peeled the metal lid from a jar of pears. The sweet, familiar scent rose and loosened something tight in her chest. The baby's eyes tracked the jar, then her hand, then the spoon she found at the bottom of the diaper bag she always carried, because it turned out mothers never stopped being pack mules. She scooped a small spoonful, blew on it even though it wasn't hot, and offered it through the mesh. The baby's mouth opened like a small bird's. He choked on the first swallow, coughed, looked surprised at his own body, then reached again. "That's it," Emily whispered. "That's it, sweetheart." The shepherd pressed closer, her nose barely touching the rail, her breath a soft fog on the mesh. When the baby managed to swallow without coughing, the dog closed her eyes halfway, as if relief had a weight you could lay your head down under. "Police and ambulance are on their way," the operator said in her ear. "Can you tell me if there are any signs of illness or injury?" "He's thin," Emily said, spooning another measure of puree. "Hungry. There's no one else here." Her gaze swung to the hallway again, to the shadowed kitchen, to the closed door at the back. "It looks like someone was here recently. There's laundry." But she stopped. The shepherd's eyes opened fully and she lifted her head an inch, alert to the catch in Emily's voice. "But the house feels like it's been quiet a while." "Stay with the baby," the operator instructed gently. "Officers will be there in minutes." Emily fed 3 spoonfuls, then 4. She paused to let the baby rest between each, watching the tiny muscles at his jaw work, the wet sheen return to his lips. He made small, contented noises she recognized from a lifetime ago when she'd been learning Sophie's dictionary. Sophie herself slid off the couch, padded across the rug on the soft crash of diapered steps, and came to stand beside the crib. She looked up at Emily for permission, then reached a chubby finger to touch the mesh. The shepherd shifted her weight, and for a breath Emily's own breath caught. This closeness, this animal. But the dog simply set her chin on the rail, the line of her throat long and soft, eyes half-lidded in a posture that was not vigilance anymore but something like surrender. "They found us," that posture said. "They found us and brought pears." The sirens were distant at first, threading with the hum of the town beyond the bridge. Emily's heart kicked harder. She kept feeding, slow, patient, measured, until the jar was 2/3 empty and the baby's eyelids began to droop between bites. The shepherd's tail moved once, a minimal sweep that stirred dust motes in the stripe of light. She had carried a bag across a neighborhood, chosen streets that spared a stroller, nosed a swollen door, and returned to this rail to set herself as a sentinel. Now, in the moment when someone else's hands had taken up the task, her body unstrung by a degree, shoulders easing, breath evening out. She rested the full weight of her head on the crib rail and let her eyes fall that last inch into drowsy contentment, the way a mother might after seeing a fever break. There were footsteps on the porch. The shepherd's head rose, but only an inch, ears flicking. A knock, firm but cautious, and a voice called, "Police!" The dog didn't bark. Emily angled her phone down from her shoulder and called, "In here." 2 officers entered, blue uniforms filling the frame of the doorway, eyes taking everything in at once. The stroller, the toddler, the baby, the dog, the grocery bag on the floor. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back tight, looked at the shepherd and then at Emily with a question, but held it behind the professionalism that kept her voice even. "Ma'am, are you the one who called?" she asked. Emily nodded. Words came tumbling. Found the dog, the list, the bag, the house, the cry. The officer listened while the other moved toward the crib, stooping to peer in without reaching, his hands open and visible, the way good people move near small frightened things. "Paramedics are right behind us," he murmured to the baby, to Emily, to the room. Sophie pressed her forehead to Emily's thigh and then peeked around it to look up at the shepherd. "Doggy," she said solemnly, as if making a sensible announcement at a town meeting. The shepherd's eyes warmed at the sound. She dipped her nose toward Sophie's hand and sniffed, a brief acknowledgement without demand. Emily felt the pressure behind her own eyes threaten to spill, not from fear now, but from the tender ridiculousness of it. This tiny courtesy exchanged in a broken living room between a toddler and an old dog. The paramedics brought clean brightness with them, bags with zippers, a thermometer, warmed blankets. They leaned over the crib with practiced gentleness, lifted the baby with hands that remembered the right angles for small necks. He wailed once at the change of arms and then settled under the heat of the blanket, lips parting on a shaky sigh. A medic asked Emily whether he'd eaten, and she held up the jar like an offering, feeling absurdly proud of its smeared rim. "Good," the medic murmured, making a note. "That helps." "Anyone else here?" the officer asked, sweeping the hallway with a glance. Emily shook her head. "I haven't seen anyone." She hesitated. "There are towels on the step. Formula on the counter. It looks like," the officer nodded, understanding the unwritten sentence, "like someone had been doing their best until something stopped them." The shepherd watched every movement that touched the baby. When the medic reached for the blanket, the dog leaned forward to scent it, and when the medic tucked it beneath the small feet, she rested again, head back on the rail. For the longest moment, her eyes slid closed to their halfway state, lashes caught in the stripe of light like brushstrokes. There was a look there that Emily had seen exactly once before, in a mirror at 3 in the morning when Sophie's fever broke, when you let your body sag because you have filled your hands with something that can't be dropped and now, finally, someone else is taking a corner of it. "Who brought the groceries?" the second officer asked, his voice quiet now, curiosity outpacing policy. Emily didn't answer. She didn't have to. The shepherd's muzzle still held a dusting of flour from the bakery bag. The damp mark of her jaw darkened the cloth handle. The officer followed the line of Emily's gaze and exhaled softly through his nose, the sound people make when they have to recalibrate what they thought they knew about the limits of the world. They talked logistics, child protective services, a hospital check, how to secure the house. And through it all the shepherd stayed at the rail. When the paramedics lifted the baby, she stood as well, legs a little stiff, and walked beside them as far as the door, the way a mother will follow a stretcher down a hall because to stop would mean admitting you are no longer necessary. At the threshold she paused, looked back at Emily and Sophie, then forward again, tracking the small face beneath the blanket with an intensity that threaded love and duty into a single watchful strand. "We'll take him to County General," the medic said. "You can follow if—" He glanced at the officers, recalculating what he could promise. "If you want to." "I do," Emily said, before she could think herself into or out of it. She gathered Sophie, the empty jar, the spoon. She reached into the grocery bag and, on some instinct she couldn't name, lifted the loaf of bread too. The shepherd watched, then stepped aside in a polite little arc to make room for all of them in the doorway. As they moved down the hall, the dog's shoulder brushed Emily's leg, a light press, not clinging, not needy, a touch that felt like the passing of a baton. In the living room the wall clock ticked on, marking a before and an after. Light fell across the coffee table again, catching the glass of the photo frame Emily had turned upright. In it, the laughing woman held a rounder version of the baby under the arm of Summer. The shepherd in the corner of the frame had been younger then, muzzle dark, ears high. Now her muzzle showed white and her eyes were heavy with the kind of fatigue a body earns by loving past its own limits. She rested her head one last time on the crib rail, even though the crib was empty now, then let it slip down. Relief softened her whole face, as if the room itself had exhaled through her. Outside, the ambulance bayed like a promise, and the old house, for the first time in what felt like a long while, had the quiet of a place that would soon be cleaned and warmed and opened again. By the time the ambulance doors sighed shut and carried the baby away, the little house had filled with the careful bustle of people whose jobs were to make sense of messes. A social worker with a soft voice and a hard notebook stood under the ticking clock, asking questions in patient threads. Two officers moved through the rooms, opening cupboards with gloved hands, reading the life that had been paused here. A woman from Animal Services crouched near the shepherd and, after a single professional glance, holstered her pole and sat cross-legged instead, as if some part of her training had told her this case would not be solved with loops and leashes. Neighbors drifted to the gate and stayed there, weighing the thin line between curiosity and care. The first to slip through was the woman from 3 doors down, the one who watered her geraniums like a ritual and waved to anyone who made eye contact. "Ruth Henley," she told the officer, straightening her cardigan as if names still required formalities. "I've been here 42 years. I know every soul on this block by their shoes and their shadow." That baby's mother, Anna, kept to herself but always smiled. The kind of smile you could hear from inside your own head. Ruth's story came in pieces at first, the way memory arrives around grief. A cough that had lingered through winter, the way Anna started sitting on the top step instead of in the yard, a slenderness that seemed too much like subtraction. She used to call the dog Mara from the porch, Ruth said, eyes on the shepherd who lay now with her chin on her paws, watching every doorway. Mara, like the ocean at night. She said it meant strength in her mother's language. Another neighbor, Mr. Franklin with the cane nobody ever saw him use, added an offhand line that tightened the air. The baby's father shipped out last fall. Merchant crew. Said he'd be back before the new year. Storms and the world being what they are, I suppose he never did. He cleared his throat, the sound scuffing the varnish of his voice. Mail kept coming for a while. Then it didn't. The officers noted the dates on calendars curling on the fridge, counted the formula tins on the counter, measured absence with their pens. The social worker asked if anyone had a key. Nobody did. That, more than anything, told the truth about the last months here. A private family bending under a private weight. And while the adult world arranged itself around the facts, Mara shifted, rose, and padded to the cloth bag she'd carried in. She nosed it toward the animal services woman as if reminding the room where the center of the story lay. It was the younger officer, the one whose gloves were already dusted with flour from touching the bakery paper, who spotted the tape along the side of the bag, a sliver of paper tucked beneath it. He freed it gently and lifted it so the light could see. The list was nothing more than 3 words in a hand that had learned to be steady by the effort itself: milk, bread, baby food. The edges were softened by handling, a thumbprint pressed like a seal along the margin. It could have been anyone's list. It could have been printed on 1,000 kitchens. But Emily heard in it the heartbeat of instruction. This is what keeps us alive, that a mother writes when her hands are too tired to hold anything but love. How would a dog? The social worker began, then let the question fade because it sounded too simple for the evidence on the floor. Ruth lifted her chin. "Ask Hassan," she said, "at Maple Street Market. He'll tell you." Hassan arrived before anyone had a chance to call him, the bell on his shop door at the end of the block ringing itself hoarse after he saw the lights and locked the register with a hand that shook. He stood on the porch, eyes shining with disbelief that had already turned to worry. "Is she?" He meant the baby. Emily nodded. "At the hospital. He's going to be okay." Hassan closed his eyes like someone who had reached the end of a prayer and found it answered. When he opened them again, he looked at Mara the way you look at a person you owe more than you can name. "Good girl," he whispered, his voice breaking on the second word. Good girl." They asked him to start at the beginning, and he did, leaning on the porch rail as if the wood could steady what he was about to let loose. It had started with deliveries. Late winter, when Anna's cough turned into long afternoons she didn't sit through so much as survive, Hassan began bringing orders to the gate because Ruth had asked him to, because his wife had told him, "We are our street." That's it. He would set the bags on the top step, ring the bell twice, and hear Mara's feet before the door. The first time, Anna opened it herself, cheeks flushed with fever and apology. "So sorry for the trouble," she'd whispered, and he had lied kindly, "No trouble." The second time, she didn't come to the door. He heard the latch lift anyway, a pause, a soft thud of bag against floor, and then the latch settle again. "I thought she wanted privacy," he told them now. Looking back, maybe she wanted not to make anyone worry. On the third delivery, he felt a presence at his knee before he saw it. A dog's polite gravity, waiting without a sound. He looked down and Mara looked up, eyes like dark glass that reflected his own face back to him. He set the bag on the ground and she nosed the handle, tested the weight as if measuring a thing against her bones, then took it in her mouth and turned toward the door. I said to her, "Easy, Habibti," Hassan recalled, a smile ghosting through his worry. As if she spoke my mother's voice. She took 2 steps, stopped, and looked back to see if she was doing it right. And then she went inside. After that, he stopped ringing. He left the bags, and Mara fetched them with a seriousness that seemed ceremonial. On days when he could spare the minutes, he'd walk with her halfway, make sure she crossed Laurel where the curb cut was smoothest, watch her pause at the light as if she understood the meaning of the chirp. Once, in spring, a truck backfired and she flinched so hard the bag swung and smacked her shoulder, bread thudding against the cloth. She steadied herself, widened her stance, and then walked on as if she had decided fear could ride along but not drive. As Anna got thinner, the lists got shorter. Right at the start there had been onions and rice, a chicken, tea. Then the items distilled to the essentials of a baby's day. Milk, bread, baby food, Hassan said softly, tapping the paper with the side of his finger. She handed me that list through a crack in the door and said, "If I cannot answer, please, give this to her." And I said, "To who?" And she said, "To Mara." I laughed because I thought I had misunderstood, and then she laughed too, but she was crying. He swallowed. After that, I tied the list to the handles like she showed me. Bad weather made maps of the story on Mara's body. After the week of rain that turned the alley to a bruise, Hassan had dried her with a towel in the store doorway, rubbing between her paw pads where grit had collected like sorrow. In July's flat heat, he'd added an extra bottle of water to the bag and a crust of ice wrapped in paper. The condensation had beaded on her whiskers as she carried both. Once, when the bridge boards buckled and crews roped off the easy way, he watched her stop at the sawhorse, reconsider the world, and choose the long path that skirted traffic and cut behind the church. She'd learned the hour the schoolchildren spilled onto the sidewalk and avoided it, learned which yard had a loose terrier who barked until he remembered everyone's name, learned the corner where the acacia dropped thorns and how to angle her paws around them. Ruth filled in the rest with the neighbor's view, the nights when the kitchen light burned late, throwing a trapezoid onto the fence, the mornings when it didn't turn on at all. Sometimes I would hear the baby cry and then Mara's nails on the floor, click, 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 like a metronome that kept time with the world, she said. And then quiet again. She looked at Emily, eyes brimming with the apology of hindsight. I should have knocked more. I should have insisted. But there's a way you think you're being respectful, and really you're being afraid. The social worker didn't scold. She nodded with the compassion of someone who knows how thin the lines get at the edges of people's lives. She asked gentle, pointed things. Had anyone seen family visit? Had anyone noticed a car come and go? And the neighbors sifted their days for answers. Too often, the answers were shrugs that hurt. In the living room, the animal services woman had edged closer to Mara and laid a palm on the rug between them, not touching the dog, just making a warm patch of earth available. Mara, she said quietly, testing the name like a key. The shepherd lifted her head. Up close, Emily could see the years in her, the silver at her muzzle, the worn velvet of her ears, the nail on one toe nicked short where life had caught it. There were raw places on her pads, small, healed moons that told the story Hassan had just given words to. When the woman finally extended her fingers, Mara leaned forward and pressed her nose into the offered hand once, not asking for anything, just saying, "I hear you." The woman's face changed the way people's faces change when the world shows them something both impossible and plainly true. "We're not taking her anywhere tonight," she said aloud, to the room, to her own clipboard. "She belongs right here until we know better." The report that finally took shape read like the outline of a film you wish you'd never had to see. Illness, distance, a father who went to sea and didn't return, a mother who wrote lists until she couldn't, a street that tried in its piecemeal ways, a grocer who tied strings to handles and laid prayer on top of it, and a dog who memorized everything a baby's day requires and made it happen one block at a time. Emily stood with Sophie on her hip, listening to the story assemble itself into a whole, and felt the ache in her chest expand into something larger, less about pain than about the fact of being human alongside other lives. She looked at the list in the officer's hands and had to steady herself against the couch because she could imagine the exact moment it had been written. A woman already thin with fever, pen scratching, mouth set to the task of making the world manageable for the creature who would outlive her by a day and needed a job to fill that day. Hassan looked around the room as if searching for permission, then stepped in and knelt by Mara's side. He untied the fraying twine and smoothed it between his fingers like worry beads. "You did it," he whispered, close enough that only the dog and the dust motes heard him. "You did everything she asked." Mara turned her head and rested it, briefly, against his knee. It was not a flourish. It was not theater. It was the kind of touch a body gives when it recognizes another body that has also been carrying something heavy. Outside, the sun had lowered itself to the level where blinds and leaves collude to make gold lace. The officers finished their notes. The social worker closed her notebook and opened her face. "We have family to call," she said. "We have news to gather from too far away. But for tonight he's safe." She looked at Emily in a way that acknowledged, without saying, that pear on a spoon counts as rescue too. Before the room exhaled into the administrative lull that follows crisis, Ruth cleared her throat. "I came over last month," she said, guilt still vibrating in her voice. "I was going to bring chicken soup. I stepped on the top step and froze, because the baby was asleep and the house was quiet as a church. And there on the inside of the door, stuck with a strip of tape at dog-nose height, was this." She reached into her sweater and, with old woman magic, produced a small folded thing. She must have slipped it into her pocket without admitting to herself that she had done it. She handed it to the officer, who opened it with gloved care. It was the same paper as the list on the bag, the same hand, but these words shoved the breath sideways in Emily's chest. "If I am sleeping and cannot answer, please help Mara bring these. Thank you." Below it, in a smaller script, a name, and a P.S. that was not a request so much as a benediction. "She knows the way." There it was, the last instruction, both mundane and monumental: how to keep the engine of a tiny life idling until someone could take the wheel. The room went still around the sentence. Even Sophie seemed to sense it. She shifted and then laid her head along Emily's shoulder with the boneless trust of toddlers and those who belong. Mara, perhaps responding to the subtle change in the air, lifted her head too and looked, really looked, at the paper as if a dog could read. Maybe she couldn't, or maybe she didn't need to. She had already translated it into muscle and habit and the sore places on her feet. Later, when their statements had been taken and the house had been made as neat as a story like this allows, Emily buckled Sophie into the stroller and paused in the doorway. The photo on the table caught a last film of light. She angled it so the woman's smile faced the room again. "We'll keep going," she heard herself say, not sure to whom. "We'll keep going." Behind her, Mara settled by the crib out of reflex, head on the rail though it was empty now, and closed her eyes in a way that looked like rest for the first time all day. In the paper on the coffee table, 3 small words still held a whole house together: milk, bread, baby food. And in the space between those words and the living bodies who had obeyed them, a street learned what it had always most wanted to know about itself. At first, the hospital corridors made the decisions feel easy. Machines hummed, the baby slept with his fists curled near his chin, and Mara lay on the polished linoleum just outside the pediatric room, her head between her paws like a sentry who'd finally found the door she'd been guarding in her dreams. But hospitals are way stations, not destinations. By the second morning, the questions arrived, in clipboards and careful voices and a stack of forms thick enough to muffle a heartbeat. Who would take the baby when he was discharged? Where would Mara go while ownership and welfare status were established? Did anyone have standing to keep them together? Emily held Sophie on her hip and watched 2 departments, Child and Family Services and Animal Control, occupy opposite corners of the same waiting area with the territorial awkwardness of cats at a dinner party. The social worker from the house, Ms. Alvarez, kept her tone warm and her words precise. The animal services officer, the same woman who had sat cross-legged on the rug, spoke softly too, but her policy binder seemed to tug at her sleeve with every sentence. "We have to do a medical hold," she said, eyes on Mara. 72 hours. Standard after a neglect case, even when the neglect wasn't of the dog. Neglect, Hassan echoed under his breath, the word catching as if it had barbs. He and Ruth had come to the hospital with a bag of sliced peaches and a bouquet of geraniums wrapped in damp newspaper. She was the opposite of neglected, he said, more to the floor than anyone else. She was employed. Ms. Alvarez tried a different angle. "And the baby? He can't go home. There isn't one. We're checking for relatives. If we don't find any, we'll place him in emergency foster care." Her eyes flicked to Emily, not by accident. "You said you'd be willing to help." Emily had already said it 3 times. twice to staff and once to herself out loud in the supply closet when she went to cry and came out with resolve instead. "I can take them," she said again, steady now. "Both of them. My house is quiet. Sophie is gentle. I'll sleep on the floor if I have to. Don't separate them." "It's not as simple as," the animal services officer began, and then closed the policy binder and let her shoulders drop. "Dogs can't be released to non-owners during a hold. And this dog, she technically doesn't have an owner on paper." She looked at Mara, who had heard her name, and lifted her head, tilting it 4 degrees as if trying to fall into the language. "But I'm not blind," the officer added, softer. "I know what separation does." Ms. Alvarez thumbed through her own files. "Emergency kinship placements are for family," she murmured, thinking out loud. "But there's also fictive kin, a person connected by bond rather than blood. Courts make exceptions with cause." She looked up at Emily. "If you petition to foster, we can fast-track a home check. It's not a promise. It's a process." "Then start it," Emily said. "Start everything." By afternoon, the story had slipped past the hospital's brick and mortar and into the street the way rain sets a rumor free. Ruth called her niece, who called her group chat, which called the internet, and suddenly Maple Street Market's Facebook page carried a trembling iPhone video of Mara trotting up to Hassan's doorway with a cloth bag and a grace that made people's throats hurt. His caption said only, "Her name is Mara. She kept a baby alive." By evening the comment count had outgrown the page. Strangers offered formula, money, a crib, a lawyer. A local reporter messaged, then called, then arrived with a camera and the kind of tears journalists keep in their voices, not on their faces. "Can we share this?" she asked, already sharing it. On screen, the list, milk, bread, baby food, looked like a manifesto written in pencil. Donations found their own gravity. Someone set up a fund for the baby's care, and money poured in faster than the hospital could invent a name for it. Diapers arrived in a polite avalanche. A high school art class painted a mural on butcher paper, a German shepherd with a cloth bag and a crown of wheat, the words "Good Girl," Mara stitched along the bottom in marker. The bakery on Cedar rolled out a crusty oval they called the Mara loaf and slipped $2 from every sale into the fund with a satisfaction that made the register drawer look proud. Kids chalked hearts along the sidewalk outside the boarded house, and under the hearts they wrote the 3 words everyone knew by now, like a spell: milk. Bread. Baby food. If the attention complicated things for child and family services, Ms. Alvarez didn't let it show. "Public interest doesn't replace law," she told Emily gently, "but it can remind us what law is for." Her to-do list sprouted extra branches, background checks for Emily and anyone who'd be in the house, a home inspection that would notice whether the bleach lived up high, safety latch checks, the quick and dirty interview with Sophie that amounted to, "Do you like puppies?" and Sophie nodding solemnly and saying, "Doggy carry bag," as if giving expert testimony. Animal Services ran its own gauntlet. A veterinary exam to map the soreness on Mara's pads, blood work to rule out the invisible kinds of tired, a behavioral assessment that felt almost impolite given the evidence of her restraint carved into every day of the last months. "She's older," the vet said, rubbing at the soft gray on Mara's muzzle. "Arthritis in her hips. Worn but not broken. She's purposeful." The behavioral notes came back with a phrase the city software rarely had reason to choose: "Extraordinary tolerance, seeks the baby with focus." For the hold period, Animal Services proposed the municipal shelter. The word alone made Emily's stomach flip. The officer with the binder saw it and reconsidered in real time. "We can do medical boarding with a partner clinic instead," she offered. "Cleaner, quieter. You can visit. I'll put it in the file that her welfare includes proximity to the infant." She wrote the last clause like a dare to anyone who might read it and try to erase the obvious. Proximity took the shape of twice daily visits. Emily would wheel Sophie up the elevator and down the hall where the clinic hummed, and the tech at the desk would say, "Mara's been waiting," even though nobody had said waiting was what she was doing. In the stainless steel run, Mara would rise with a slow unfurling and pad forward, pressing her chest to the bars so that Emily's palm met fur and metal in the same touch. They learned each other's habits quickly, Mara's polite refusal of treats until after she had sniffed the baby's sock. The way her eyes softened, pupils dilating like earth-taking rain, when Sophie babbled sing-song nonsense at her through the slats. The barely their whine that escaped her when the nurse rolled the infant bassinet past the doorway on the way to the NICU weighing. The visits made allies out of strangers. The clinic staff taped children's drawings to Mara's run, stick figure dogs with bags, crayon sons. A quiet woman in scrubs left a note on the clipboard. My mother kept a list on the fridge. It kept me alive too. The animal services officer stopped by after hours, sat on the floor just out of reach, and read her own policy binder like scripture, muttering, "There must be a line in here written for moments like this." Meanwhile, the official machinery turned its gears. Ms. Alvarez located an aunt in another state, voicemail only, then a cousin with a disconnected number. She petitioned the court for emergency placement authority, citing the impossibility of delaying the baby's discharge. She attached exhibits, Hassan's statement, Ruth's note with Anna's handwriting, the vet's report, screenshots of donations not as proof of anything legal, but as proof that a town had decided to be the kind of place that doesn't look away. On the animal side, the officer filed an affidavit arguing for continuity of care, a phrase that sounded sterile until you put a face on it and found it meant let her go where her work is. Emily did her part with a fervor that surprised even her, baby-proofing again, this time with 4 feet in mind. A baby gate ordered and installed between the kitchen and the living room. A soft bed laid near the crib but not against it. A vet appointment held on reserve. A folder labeled court, though the word made her a little ill. On her phone, the notification bubbles grew like a guilty garden. Messages from friends, from strangers, from a journalist in another state who wanted to talk about resilience narratives. She ignored most of them and answered only the ones that asked, "What do you and the baby need?" She kept writing the same reply, "Patience." And diapers. The city scheduled a joint hearing for late Friday afternoon in a beige room on the 3rd floor where Hope goes to sit on plastic chairs and wait for its number. The plan was simple on paper and enormous in its stakes. Child and Family Services would argue for an emergency foster placement with Emily under a fictive kin carve-out. Animal Services would request a release to the same address contingent on continued veterinary oversight and a signed care plan. Ms. Alvarez wore a blue blazer that made her look like a schoolteacher who'd decided to run the district. The Animal Services officer left her binder on her desk and brought only a single-page brief and a photograph from the house. Milk, bread, baby food. The judge, a woman with a neat bun and eyes that had seen everything twice, listened longer than the schedule allowed. She asked pointed questions that took the polite shine off language. What happens to an infant's cortisol levels when you remove the one constant in his sensorium? How does animal law account for non-ownership bonds in emergency conditions? What license does the state have to separate two beings whose shared routine has demonstrably sustained life? No one, not even the city attorney, wanted to answer, because the rules say so, because the rules were starting to look like clothes that didn't fit the person wearing them. By the time they broke, the sun had slipped behind the municipal building and turned the parking lot into a mirror. "We'll issue a written decision," the clerk said, which is the bureaucratic way of saying, you have to carry your own hope home and keep it fed overnight. They walked out together, Emily and Sophie, Ms. Alvarez with her notes, Hassan with a bag of still warm bread, Ruth with her cardigan pulled tight as if it were armor, the Animal Services officer with her jaw set the way you set a picture frame when you've finally decided where it belongs. That night stretched. Phone screens lit bedrooms like votive candles. The street posted updates the way people used to bring casseroles. Someone tied a cloth bag to the clinic door with a list tucked beneath the handle, not because anyone needed the list anymore, but because rituals matter. Inside, Mara slept in starts, waking at every small sound, then tucking her nose under her tail with a sigh that was part dog, part weather. Emily sat on her living room floor amid a scatter of diapers and a folded baby blanket that still smelled, faintly, of hospital soap. Sophie snored softly on the couch, a toy apple clutched in her fist like a sermon she hadn't finished yet. The house was ready, gates, bowls, a corner where Mara could put down what she'd carried and pick up only what she wanted. All that was left to do was wait. At 8:12 the next morning, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number and a county seal. She stared at it long enough to see her own reflection in the glass. Then she answered and said, "Hello," and held her breath while a voice on the other end cleared its throat and began to read the future aloud. The call came with the kind of formality that tried to disguise its own weight. The voice on the other end was the clerk from yesterday's hearing, but her tone carried something lighter than the beige room they'd sat in. "Miss Hale," she said, "the court has approved the fictive kin foster placement. Both the infant and the dog will be released into your care this afternoon." Emily barely heard the rest, dates, signatures, check-ins, because Sophie had come padding in from the hallway, hair a tumble of morning static, rubbing her eyes. "Doggy," she mumbled. Emily scooped her up, pressing a kiss into her curls. "Doggy's coming home," she whispered. By 2 o'clock, she was at the clinic. Mara greeted her with a thump of the tail and a low, pleased rumble that settled into silence as soon as she spotted the baby in Emily's arms. The moment they wheeled the infant carrier into view, Mara stood fully, stretched her front legs in a slow bow, and stepped forward until her nose hovered just above the blanket. A soft exhale, almost a sigh, and then she stepped back as if to say, "All right, let's go." They walked out together into a sky washed clean by morning rain. The court papers were tucked in Emily's bag, but it was the rhythm of their steps that felt official. Sophie rode in the stroller, the baby snug against Emily's chest, and Mara kept pace at her side, glancing up every few strides as if to confirm her people were still there. At home, the backyard welcomed them in the easy way only familiar places can. Grass still damp from the rain, sun laying itself out like a blanket across the patch by the fence. Sophie wasted no time. She ran to her plastic slide, then circled back to the crate in the corner where Emily had placed something for Mara. The old cloth grocery bag, washed and patched, now filled with the baby's toys. Wooden blocks, the toy apple, a cloth rabbit with one floppy ear. Mara sniffed it once, then looked over at Emily with a slow blink of understanding. Within minutes, Sophie was handing Mara toys from the bag, and Mara, in the most patient game of exchange ever played, would take each one gently, set it on the grass, and wait for the next. The baby lay on a blanket nearby, tracking the motion with wide eyes, tiny fingers opening and closing as if already part of the game. The gate latch clicked, and Huck Dawson, the silver-haired neighbor with the porch swing and a perpetual baseball cap, stepped into the yard. "Well, look at this," he said, leaning on the fence. "You'd think they'd been together forever." His eyes softened as Mara trotted over to greet him, then returned to the baby without prompting. "She's earned this, you know. Both of them have." Emily nodded, watching the way the sun caught the streak of silver along Mara's muzzle. "She's not carrying groceries anymore," she said, "but she hasn't put the job down." Huck chuckled, a warm, knowing sound. "Some work you keep doing even when no one's asking. It's just who you are." The afternoon unfolded in the kind of peace that feels deliberate, like the world has stepped back to make room for it. Sophie lined up the toys in a crooked row, Mara lying beside her with the baby curled against her ribs, his small hand resting on her fur. Every so often, Mara would shift, nudge him closer with her nose, then settle again, content in the shade. Emily stood for a long time, hands resting on the fence post, letting herself feel the weight she no longer had to carry alone. She thought of the months Mara had spent walking that grocery route, of the worn pads, the rain-soaked fur, the steady pace that had kept a baby alive when the rest of the world didn't know. No one had cheered for her then. No one had filmed it. But trip by trip, she had made something impossible look ordinary. Sometimes the greatest rescues happen quietly, Emily said aloud, half to Huck, half to herself. One trip at a time. Huck gave a small nod, as if agreeing with a truth he'd always known. As the sun began to tilt toward evening, Emily gathered the toys, leaving the old grocery bag where it hung on the fence. The light caught it just so, turning the frayed fabric into something almost golden. Mara lay in the grass, her breathing slow and even, the baby's cheek pressed against her side. Sophie curled up on the other flank, her plastic apple tucked under her chin like a treasure. Emily stood in the doorway for one last look before heading inside. The picture would stay with her. The dog, the children, the empty grocery bag swaying gently in the breeze, no longer a lifeline but a quiet testament. Mara had found her safe place to rest, and in doing so, had given it to all of them. Every story leaves a mark. If you felt the magic in today's tale, share your thoughts with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the wonders in life. See you next time, and keep the mystery alive.